I'm Grant and welcome to Second Plate, a show that focuses on reusing ingredients and making meals with really good leftovers. So tonight we're going to be making Swedish meatballs. This was actually something I wanted to seek out because I actually had a really good Swedish meatball soup, and I wanted to find a way to both make that as well as learn how to make Swedish meatballs. So what I like about this recipe is they make really good just kind of appetizers. However, you can also drop it over some, like I've been doing egg noodles. And then all the leftover sauce and like extra like meatballs that have kind of fallen apart, you can actually just add some more beef broth, any vegetables you have on hand, and then you have a soup, so you don't have all these just like leftover appetizers. You can actually make another really hearty meal out of it, and it's a nice little way to entertain guests, but still also handle some leftovers and make a good meal the next day. So I'm Grant, this is Second Plate, and let's get cooking. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is I actually have a hot griddle right here. I'm going to be just adding some butter. A big thing with this is, this might seem like a fair bit, but what we're actually going to be doing is we're going to be making the sauce in here as well. So this is going to look like way more butter than I need to just cook some onions and some garlic, but that's fine. It's going to eventually all end up in the sauce along with our cream. Okay, we got that. I'm going to go ahead and take some onions. These are just some sweet onions. The one caveat I want to say is to make sure they're actually really finely chopped. Like I would potentially go even finer than this, because if you leave them too large, they're actually going to ruin the integrity of the meatballs, because they're essentially one string, and the onions don't stick just as well to the like hamburger and pork. So if you make them too big, you won't be able to get a really nice dense meatball, because you'll have this like through line that kind of splits it no matter what. So just try to get them really nice and finely like chopped. And you can use that in like a food processor, or I just basically, before we're prepping the show, I just went through and got them really nice and fine. Just going to do that. Get these around. And let these kind of sweat while we prep the rest. And again, one thing I kind of like about this recipe is, for the most part, it's all kind of one pot. And anything that like doesn't end up in the meatballs will just end up in the sauce. So you don't even have to be that particular. I'm going to go ahead and kind of just use this one corner of the pan so that I can make sure everything gets like finely coated. I know I actually have an issue with this at my own house where, for whatever reason, I think my oven's just installed slightly to the side. So all my pans, I have to like work in one corner of them, regardless of how large they are. Got that. Got some simple garlic. Turn this up decently high. This is something I've been actually trying to do more often, where when I buy garlic, I go ahead and peel it then and there, down to just the actual little cloves. Just try and get like, well, it's not as good as completely like fresh cut, but at the same time, it means I'm not using just garlic powder all the time. Cool. Gonna just keep coating these. They should start frying up. We'll be cooking these in the meatballs as well, so they don't have to be too overdone. Gonna toss that back on while they go ahead and cook. Next, I have some simple white bread and some milk. This is, I believe, a pretty big staple in most meatballs, where the bread kind of makes the meat go a little bit further, as well as it gives it a little bit more of a differing texture is the way I would put it. So it doesn't, because you don't, in my eyes, want it to taste literally just like a round hamburger. You want something like more to it, and these, or like some breadcrumbs, really help that out. So this is just 2 slices. This is white bread, but anything that's kind of soft you could use. I think this just lends itself the best to that. Gonna take some milk. I chose 2% because this is the kind of recipe where you basically want as much dairy as you can kind of get in it. I'm going to just kind of coat this. About 1/4 cup to 1/2 cup. Nothing too bad, because again, anything that's like extra and left over is actually going to end up in our sauce. We'll actually be adding heavy cream. So if I added too little or too much milk now, that's not going to be a concern later. So we're just going to let that kind of soak. It's going to make up kind of a good consistency to our overall meatballs. Okay, going to keep these going right here. Next, as for the actual like ingredients in the meatball, I'm going to be using 2 egg yolks, not the whites, just the yolks. I'm going to be using some allspice, nutmeg, salt, pepper. I actually, personally, I've been really liking adding the garlic, the whole garlic, but I've used garlic powder in the past as well. This is something where I think the spices are the main thing you want to figure out to dial in for like what's your meatball. Like looking at the other ingredients, like the meats, it's basically a 50-50 split between ground chuck and ground pork. But one thing I've also considered but have not tried is going straight for Italian sausage, particularly like a spicier Italian sausage if you want a spicy meatball. For Swedish meatballs, I figured it might be, probably not the best thing to have spicy. However, you do have like a cream sauce with it, so that should help kind of negate it. But if you're going for more of like an Italian meatball, that's one thing you could do to kind of mix it up. Or if you want to be super, like, what I like to call as like homemade tasting, go really hard on the allspice and like the nutmeg, and feels very, I would describe like warm and hearty is just honestly how I would describe that. So anyway, I have a little standing mixer here. We're gonna go ahead and add our meat in while the rest cooks. So this is the ground pork. Really the amount of meat you'll be adding is going to be what determines basically the ratio of the rest of the ingredients. So I'm going to go 50-50 here. This is about 3/4 pound of pork. And then I'm going to go for, this is 1/2 pound of just ground chuck beef. I wanted to do more with the pork because I think it's just in general a little bit more lean. And again, I'm really just afraid I don't want these to come out tasting just as if I had raw ground beef put in there alone with no spices. So I try to lean more into like the pork, or I mentioned the sausage before. So keep at this. Let me just stir some of our garlic, it's getting a little hot. Reduce the heat on that. Then take my spices, just go ahead and add them in one by one. Salt. I have to say one luxury that I kind of miss, just adding our bread here, for cooking, say, soups versus like a dish like this is, with soups, it's so much easier to really dial in the ingredients because you can taste it as you go, but with like meatballs, that's not the case. So I'm just gonna go kind of crack this egg over here, and I'm just gonna kind of funnel out the yolk. Let's go. Can't say I'm the best at doing this, depending on how the egg cracks, but really I'm just trying to get it down to just the egg yolk itself. And this is just going more for like the richness of the meatball. I can't imagine it's going to be a big deal if you add in the actual, the whites of the egg, but that's how I've seen it done. There's a couple ways to do this. I kind of just go for it because I never really have that many egg yolks put in. I know there's a lot of gimmicky ways to separate the yolks, but as long as you don't actually pierce the yolk, you're fine. I know my girlfriend, she personally prefers the way where you just kind of juggle the yolk between 2 halves of the eggs. I'm not that good. I know some people love the more gimmicky route where you get like, say, a pop bottle or something, and you essentially shuffle that back and forth. Sorry, not shuffle it. You suction out the yolk and put it in, but I figure that's a little bit cheesy for the show. So I got that, so while being careful here not to touch this with my hands, I'm gonna go ahead and get my onions in here. Garlic, looks like that garlic's a little dark. And we're gonna go ahead and leave this hot because we're going to be forming our meatballs and then putting them back in here and then actually creating our sauce in here as well. Cool, so I'm gonna go ahead and put this down and let this slowly mix for a couple minutes while I go wash my hands. After about a good amount of mixing here, I'm going to go ahead and lift this up and take a look. Trying to go for a fairly decent consistency. Looks good. This is the last time we need that. I'm just going to scoop this down. It's going to be, I always feel like it looks almost more like a tuna or chicken salad because you can tell it's not just the meat in the consistency. And that's what's going to actually form our meatballs. The main thing I would look for is that everything kind of pulled together and there's no big chunks of anything. I have had it where you just get a ball of onions that for some reason sticks together with the eggs and themselves, and that can kind of ruin the integrity of your meatballs. But what I'm going to go ahead and do next is I'm going to transfer them back onto this hot griddle. Add some more. Add some more butter. Cool. And then I'm just going to slowly start forming the meatballs. I like to get them probably about like that big. I have found that smaller is better unless you're going to use them for a meal, because then you can go like a big giant ball because you'll have like assumedly something like some pasta dish or something that they can like cut into and eat with. But if you're going for more of like a appetizer thing, you want it to be nice and tiny, like literally just bite size, something you can eat the entire thing in one go. Also, it's just a little bit easier to keep them together if you don't make them too big, or rather if one or two of them starts to fall apart, it doesn't matter if you make a lot of them. Okay, I'm just going to reach in here, just slowly pack this, just as if you're making a, honestly, just a burger patty. I'm just going to transfer, put it in the pan. I found that generally they don't stay perfectly round because I'm going to want to kind of like move them around and they'll like flatten out as they get a crispy side and all that. Plus, if you make them smaller, it's a little bit easier to tell when they're done. If you made them like really large, I would say you have to like take the temperature of each one individually. But if they're fairly small, it's pretty easy to see when they're actually done all the way through. So you can make sure they're done without having to do some really annoying, like a lot of temperature tests on each individual meatball. Cool. If you have, say, like a, not sure exactly what, but an ice cream scoop with a an action on it that lets you like easily chop the meat off of it, you can make really nice uniform meatballs, and it goes pretty quick. So that's something like, if you make this often, it's probably worth investing in, because you can really just like scoop, dip, just kind of clip it off, scoop, do another one. It really takes down the time. I'd imagine you could probably do something even more out there if you wanted to, like just do them all in a muffin tin or something and just bake them. That probably wouldn't be too bad. The reason we do it on top of this here is it lets us make the sauce from the actual meatballs. But if, say, you were going to buy some other sauce, like pre-made, or I know a lot of recipes I went across recommend just using cream of mushroom soup, at least just as a base to get this started, then it's not really that big of a deal. So it's like, yeah, why not? Maybe just to like toss them in, bake them easily, and then apply the sauce later. Go. One thing I've been trying to keep my eye out for that I just can't seem to find is some like basic food prep disposable gloves, because I know when I worked with food before, like it seems, I think, it comes across as something like you have to wear those for the sake of food safety, which you do, but also just as a raw utility, being able to just say, I'm going to take off these gloves and my hands are going to be clean, that is a great help in the kitchen. There's so many recipes like, man, I just wish I had gloves. But then I also always wonder, it's like, do I really want to use disposable gloves when I could just wash my hands? But it's something that if you hadn't considered it because you don't work in a restaurant, I actually would recommend it as a tool, just because there's a lot of stuff like this where you can just save your time, or like working with meat, sometimes I find myself having to like wash my hands over and over because it's like, okay, I'm going to do eggs and then I'm going to do this meat and then maybe I have some other dish over here. And it just, you can eliminate all of that by having that nice clear separation where it's like, okay, I'm going to go into the meat, do my thing, then just take off the gloves, go back to prepping a salad or something, what have you. there. And this would also be a really nice point where if you know you're going to have leftovers, you've already made these meatballs, and you probably don't even need to form them. But I could easily say, hey, I want like 6 for tonight, and then I could just form if I want, but then save them for an easier cooking. Kind of like how like some people will like freeze patties or like cook them up. Cool. So we go ahead and we're going to let these sit. And the main thing we're looking for is you don't actually have to cook them all the way through right now. One variant of this recipe I've seen done is you're essentially going to try and just sear them so that they have kind of a hard outer casing. And then once that's done, toss them into the oven while you finish like the sauce and let that actually thoroughly cook them all through. Plus that also has the benefit, which will kind of simulate with the cover of this here, of letting the sauce cover and like cook down and reduce while still getting them all nice and consistent because you're baking them. So I'm going to go ahead and let these sit while I clean up, and we'll come back and probably fry up the sauce. I went ahead and flipped them over. You can start seeing more of this like crust that I'm going for on many of these. At this point, you can see they're still not fully done, but that's okay because we're still going to have to cook them more once they're in the sauce. So once you get a nice little bit of a crust, I like to flip them once, kind of pad them down a little bit so they end up being a little more patty-ish, but then you do get a better like sear on top of it. I'm going to go ahead and just transfer them to here. If you want to keep them warm, if you think it's going to take a long time, you can actually just add them to a warming dish in your oven. Like my oven has a warming mode or like 200 degrees. But the main thing to look for is you'll notice everywhere the meatball was, you have that sear, and that's kind of my understanding to be the base of the sauce. And that's why it's useful and important to cook them in the same pan. I would also like to point out how like these are a lot softer. I don't know if it comes across the camera, but much more soft compared to, say, a burger. And I think that's something that's nice to point out as a feature of a meatball to differentiate it from literally just ground beef in a ball. Okay, going to transfer that here. We're going to go ahead and add some beef broth, depending on how much sauce we want. Let that gather. I'm trying to get all around. I'm not super familiar with the entire terms for this, but I believe this is called like a roux, and you're deglazing it. Essentially, the steam of the broth kicks up the stuff from the pan, all the fats and juices, and then that's kind of how we get the flavor from them into the sauce. Then we're going to add some heavy whipping cream or more of the milk from earlier, and that's what actually gives it the more Swedish meatball color. I'm going to go ahead and use my clean tongs, and we're just going to slowly start sifting this around, and you can start seeing the color come in. Looks like we got some pretty heavy sear if we get some of those black parts, or that could be the garlic. And you start to see that more signature color. And this is one reason why I talked about, since we're using beef broth for this, that you can easily transform that into a soup. Is with the leftover meatballs, or you could do it directly, all you can really do is just add more beef broth and you have a soup. And then you just take that a step further. I would probably say add some like potatoes in, and basically make kind of like a potato-ish soup. But it should have the flavor of the meatballs because you'll have a little bit of flakes in there, and plus any of the meatballs you have left over. And it's a good way where this is a lot of meat just for like say like one person, but you can split that into a soup, really make some more stuff out of it. Okay, let's set that down right there. Now I just have some flour, and what we're going to be using this for is to thicken out our sauce. So I'm just going to toss this around right here. This is really good if you have a whisk, I think I'm saying that right, to actually break up these chunks, but I'm just going to kind of keep stirring it with my tongs and then adding it more and more. Usually this doesn't matter how long this takes because a lot of times I'll have, say, my meatballs kind of warming up in the background, finishing their own cooking cycles. but we're just gonna keep going around until we reach the consistency we want. You can use basically any other similar powder to thicken your sauce, like I believe cornstarch would work. Personally, I've been really trying to use instant mashed potatoes to achieve that function, just because they kind of work in the same way, plus they're really cheap. Good way to just add mass to the dishes. And it's just something I've been experimenting, which is why I also kind of talked about doing a potato soup out of this. Cool. And this is just mainly eyeballing. For me, it's just really a question of like your personal kitchen and how long you're willing to wait for other stuff, because what you could also do is once you get it decently thick, if you're willing to wait a decent amount of time, you can just let it reduce down in, say, an oven or a pot. And in fact, like another great recommendation for making a recipe like this is a slow cooker, just because then the sauce is going to really soak into the meatballs and have that really long simmering time. So I actually heavily recommend that as an alternative if you are okay taking a little bit more time to do it. But I personally like to add a little bit more flour than reducing, just because it takes less time and I can kind of pick how I want it. Essentially, the more flour I add, the thicker it gets, and if I ever go too far, I just add more broth, more cream. You can see it start really thickening up in the center here, how it's no longer running. But this is all just personal preference. I think I would say it goes without saying that the probably better way overall is to let it reduce, but that does take time. That's why if you have the time for like the slow cooker version, I think that's when you can really make like a really succulent sauce if you're willing to just let it sit there. Start seeing it's pretty thick here. So I'm going to start actually re-adding my meatballs. I'm going to go all around the corners here where I have more sauces. And it's actually at this point, one thing about the actual sauce, if you didn't mind letting it cool down, is you should be able to taste it, because at this point, while the meatballs themselves need more time actually to be cooked all the way through, the sauce should be good because it's just those individual scraps from the searing. So you'd be okay to just kind of like taste it and see, is it the consistency that you actually want? So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through and kind of just flip them, try to just immerse them as best I can. Personally, if this was me at home, I would transfer this to a Dutch oven I have. And that way, just with the one I have, it curs really drastically, so it lets you get a lot of the meatballs in and really just let them kind of cook in this soup. And then also looks like a fancier serving dish than just, say, a lot of my other bowls. And I can just pull that out directly, put it on the stovetop, and people can dish it straight from there. Especially because if you let them really, like have the sauce really reduce down, you can say, let it reduce down to the point where the meatballs become visible. You can just like put some toothpicks in and you can just lift it out that way, or tongs. But we're gonna go ahead and do that and let these soak. And then it's just up to us. Do we want to keep turning them? Do you want like a really dense, thick sauce that like permeates it? Or maybe depending on how you're serving it, you might instead let them, or whoever you have eating, take the meatballs and then also dish out additional sauce. It's kind of up to you and what your preference for this is. Like I found if I'm going to make a meal out of it, so say with like noodles, I will not let them sit too long because I'm not looking for the actual meatball to carry all the flavor. Rather, you can add the meatballs to your pasta or what have you, and then apply the sauce as well on top of it. So you only really, on that case, need to get a good coating on the outside. Whereas if you're going for like a hors d'oeuvres kind of thing, that's where I'd say you really want to like let them soak, because that one meatball needs to have all the flavor. You want a really thick sauce that it will either cling to or get stuck inside of the meatball, so that when you pull one meatball out and have it by itself, it's the full flavor. With noodles though, it's a little bit easier to like let the noodles kind of carry the sauce and the flavor. But these will be good in probably about like 5 minutes. Easy way to make sure they are 100% good, temp them. They should probably temp about like 160-ish just to make sure they're completely done all the way through. If everything else is consistent, really you should be fine temping the largest meatballs just because that's what's going to be the coldest usually. If you have tiny ones, they fry up pretty fast, so they can be pretty quick. And in fact, if you're making smaller meatballs, one of the things that's kind of nice is you can just work in 2 halves of the pan and you just say, okay, sear this one up, okay, this one's done, move it over the sauce, make another meatball, put it on, and you can kind of just keep a revolving belt going, and that makes it a little bit easier to get, say, food out faster than, okay, I gotta do this whole big batch before anyone can have anything. But we're going to go ahead and let that sit and check on them in just a little bit. After they've been sitting for a decent bit, I'm gonna go ahead and check on them. I find it usually pretty good to just find the largest one, kind of cut into it, make sure it's done all the way through. It's pretty much a given that if you have a equally heated pan, if the largest one's done, then say these smaller ones are done as well. Now's a good time to get any other sauces. So I'm actually going to turn this down and we're going to start actually plating up our meatballs. And it's not a big deal if these fall apart because they should be a little bit soft and a little bit mushy, but let's go ahead and grab several of these. And then generally what I like to do is just kind of collect the sauce because it's helpful to have a pool in the bottom. Just drizzle it over. And this is the point where I said kind of like how we made the sauce before by getting all these extra drippings off using broth. Now would be a great time to start on, say, a soup. Just because that lets you kind of actually clean the pan just a little bit easier. And it also lets you just get more out of it. Cool, so the goal here is, I don't think there's a huge science to plating these because usually it's kind of a self-serve thing. But I'm gonna go for the really thick, completely covered meatballs on the bottom, just as a personal preference. If I assume people are gonna come in and if I'm serving this at a party, get that nice layer of really thick, really covered stuff for people who want it. And then some lighter stuff that ideally shows off its sear on the top so you can see the actual meat. Because I do want to prominently feature the meatballs themselves. That is the draw, because otherwise it's just a cream sauce. And really, this isn't just a vector for the cream sauce, it is the meatballs. That's the feature. Cool. Get one more in here. There we have our Swedish meatballs. And it'll be at this point, if I'm plating it up, again, just depending on if you're going for a party thing, I think the customary way is you put them either with a small fork or a toothpick. That way it's just very easy pick and serve and you just give them a nice space on a dish. Otherwise, the way I would serve it is, again, I prefer my Dutch oven because it lets you, again, pick out individual meatballs. Usually I'll make it a sauce that's not too thick, but then you can also reach in and dish out the sauce on whatever you have just available. But overall, it's a nice little recipe. It's something where it's just got the right amount of kind of exoticness to it where it's oh, it's a treat. It's not something you would just make on any Monday night. However, just knowing how to make a meatball and knowing how to do the basic steps here, it lets you actually do a lot of cool stuff with the meat. I mentioned before that I actually have been trying to work up a Swedish meatball soup because really it's the same process. We just kind of make it thicker, make it a soup, add some vegetables. I'd actually really love to try some basic sandwiches with this. I think you could make a kind of an interesting burger where it's okay, well, let's prep the burger the same way, but instead of using bread, we just keep it straight, like a straight burger patty, but make the sauce the right way so you have that extra bit to soak into the bread. It's something where once you kind of have it down, it's a surprisingly simple recipe that you could actually cut way down and just make super simple, or go way over the top, and it always will just look a little bit fancy. Nothing huge, but it's something that you can whip up pretty quickly and in advance and just throw them out on the grill and still whip up the sauce really quick if you did the prep work before. But anyway, I'm Grant. This is second plate. See you again next week.